Imagine this in Washington. Billions of dollars flow into Wall Street without a single eyebrow raised. But in Accra, the moment Ghana injects its own hard-earned reserves to rescue its currency, alarms start blaring in Washington, Brussels, and the IMF boardroom. The accusation: currency manipulation. The real crime: daring to act without permission. It was early 2025 and Ghana was staring down an economic storm. The Cedi had plunged to historic lows. Inflation was chewing through salaries faster than families could earn them. Market stalls changed prices daily. Imported goods climbed out of reach. For decades, Ghana had played by the rules, borrowing, devaluing, waiting for the next tranche of IMF support. But this time, the government didn't wait. Without fanfare, the Bank of Ghana moved. Using its limited US dollar reserves, it stepped into the market, boosting the Cedi's value and giving ordinary Ghanaians a moment to breathe. And it worked, at least on paper. The Cedi surged. Inflation slowed. Traders paused their relentless price hikes. Parents could buy food without watching their paychecks vanish by mid-month. But instead of congratulations, Ghana got condemnation. The IMF sent no relief, only warnings. The message was unmistakable: African nations may borrow, but they must not lead. So here's the question: was Ghana reckless? Or was it finally claiming the economic sovereignty it had been denied for decades? And more importantly, if Ghana succeeds, who's next? Nigeria, Kenya, or perhaps Burkina Faso, where President Ibrahim Traoré has been championing the same sovereignty-first vision. This is not just a story about exchange rates. It's about who gets to write the rules and who gets punished for breaking them. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you might see why one quiet decision in Accra is sending shivers through the global financial order. If you believe Africa should decide its own economic future, share this message. And subscribe if you think the truth matters more than the headlines. It began quietly, without the usual parade of press conferences or international approval. By January 2025, the Ghanaian Cedi had hit its weakest point in modern history. Street markets in Accra were in chaos. Tomatoes doubled in price. Overnight cooking oil became a luxury, and taxi drivers complained that fuel costs were eating up their daily earnings. Inflation was on track to reach a staggering 38%, a level that threatened to pull the middle class into poverty and push the poor into desperation. For decades, Ghana had responded to such crises in a predictable way: wait for the IMF or other lenders to approve a support package, agree to structural reforms that often meant painful austerity, and devalue the currency to attract foreign investors. But this time, something shifted. The government chose not to wait for permission. Inside the Bank of Ghana's headquarters, policymakers made a calculated decision. They would use the nation's limited foreign reserves, precious US dollars held for emergencies, to intervene directly in the foreign exchange market. By selling dollars and buying cedis, they could strengthen the local currency, make imports cheaper, and break the fever of inflation. It was a high-risk gamble. Ghana's reserves were not deep. Every dollar spent in this fight was one less available for future crises. But the leadership believed the alternative, doing nothing, would be far more damaging, both economically and politically. In February, the effects began to show. The Cedi, once spiraling downward, began to climb. Within 3 months, it had regained nearly 20% of its value against the US dollar. Importers breathed a sigh of relief. Supermarket owners stopped changing prices every few days. For the first time in months, fuel prices stabilized, giving some breathing space to bus drivers, farmers, and small business owners who lived on thin profit margins. On the streets of Kumasi and Tamale, ordinary people noticed. A school teacher interviewed by local radio put it simply: "I don't care what Washington calls it. If my salary stops disappearing before the end of the month, that's all the policy I need." But while the public welcomed the relief, the move had a much larger significance. Ghana was rewriting the script that had governed African economies for decades, the unwritten rule that African nations could only take bold financial actions with the blessing of Western institutions. This independence was not lost on observers across the continent. In Burkina Faso, where President Ibrahim Traoré had launched his own sovereignty-first economic reforms, state-run media described Ghana's maneuver as a blueprint for African resilience. In Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, editorials questioned whether the IMF model borrow, obey, adjust was still relevant. Yet at the heart of the story was still the Bank of Ghana's simple act, using its own tools to protect its currency. There were no demands for debt cancellation, no threats to leave the IMF, no nationalization of banks, just a decision to act. And for the IMF, that decision crossed a line. By March, the fund issued a carefully worded but unmistakably stern statement accusing Ghana of currency manipulation and undermining market transparency. The implication was clear in the global financial order: a developing country defending its own currency without approval could be treated as a threat to the system itself. The IMF warned that Ghana's interventions could jeopardize its ongoing debt restructuring talks, a subtle but powerful form of pressure. At the same time, IMF officials arrived in Accra not to offer new funding or relief, but to tell the government to stop. But Ghana didn't stop. Instead, the Bank of Ghana doubled down, insisting that stabilization is not manipulation, and that reserves existed precisely for moments like this. Inside Parliament, the debate turned fierce. Opposition MPs accused the government of artificially inflating the currency and risking a long-term collapse. Pro-government MPs defended the move as an act of sovereignty, portraying the IMF's stance as an attack on Ghana's right to self-determination. As the weeks passed, the standoff became more than an economic dispute. It became a test of political will. In the eyes of many Ghanaians, the issue was no longer just about the exchange rate. It was about whether their nation would be allowed to solve its own problems without external interference. What made the situation even more remarkable was how much attention it began to attract abroad. African diaspora networks lit up with debates and messages of support. Economists from across the continent wrote op-eds praising Ghana's courage. Even in countries far from West Africa, whispers of the Ghana model began to circulate in policy discussions. For the IMF and its allies, the risk was obvious. If Ghana succeeded, other nations might try the same. Nigeria, Kenya, and yes, Burkina Faso could decide to bypass the usual playbook, weakening the leverage that global financial institutions had maintained for decades. The reality on the ground in Ghana was simpler, the market was calmer, the currency was stronger, and for many families, life had become just a bit less desperate. But the government knew this fragile progress could vanish if the Cedi began to slide again, or if the pressure from the IMF intensified. Still, for the moment, the gamble seemed to be paying off. And in Accra's halls of power, there was a growing sense that Ghana had crossed a point of no return. Whether they won or lost, they had shown the continent and the world that it was possible to act first and explain later. The confrontation reached its boiling point in March 2025, when the IMF's statement accusing Ghana of currency manipulation hit international wires. It was more than just financial jargon. It was a signal to markets, lenders, and investors that Ghana was stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The message was aimed not only at Accra, but at every other African capital watching closely. Don't try this at home. Within days, an IMF technical delegation landed in Accra. There were no ceremonial handshakes, no promises of assistance, just closed-door meetings with top officials at the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Ghana. According to leaks from inside the discussions, the fund demanded an immediate halt to interventions, urging Ghana to let the market correct itself. But the government refused to bend. At a tense press conference that week, Bank of Ghana officials stood firm. We are not manipulating. We are stabilizing. Our reserves exist for moments like this, and this is our decision to make. That defiance electrified the political climate. Inside Parliament, opposition MPs seized the moment, accusing the administration of playing a dangerous game with the nation's economic future. They argued that the interventions were artificially propping up the Cedi, masking deeper structural problems and risking Ghana's hard-earned reputation in international markets. Pro-government voices hit back even harder. To them, the IMF's actions were not about economics, but about control. One ruling party MP declared, "If defending our currency is a crime, then sovereignty itself is on trial." The debate spilled into the streets. In Accra's Makola market, traders told journalists they didn't care what the IMF thought as long as prices stopped rising. A young importer of electronics said, "If the Cedi is stronger, I can sell at fair prices. That means more customers, more jobs. How is that bad?" But not everyone shared the optimism. Some local economists warned that with over $1.2 billion in reserves already spent in just 6 months, the strategy could become unsustainable. A leaked memo from a regional bank suggested Ghana's reserves might run dangerously low by year's end if interventions continued at the same pace. The government, however, was already moving into the next phase. The Bank of Ghana began targeting speculative traders who were betting against the Cedi, imposing tighter controls and monitoring large forex transactions. Officials accused certain market actors, both domestic and foreign, of engineering volatility for profit. This escalation transformed the standoff from a simple policy disagreement into a symbolic battle for control over Ghana's financial destiny. It was no longer just the Cedi's value at stake, it was the narrative of who governs African economies. Across the continent, the ripple effects were immediate. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré publicly praised Ghana's stance, calling it an act of financial courage that speaks for all of Africa. Mali and Niger's state broadcasters aired segments framing Ghana as the first domino in a possible chain of monetary rebellions. In Dakar and Abidjan, editorial boards debated whether their own central banks should study the Ghana model. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, IMF interventions had been presented as partnerships, yet here was a long-standing partner rejecting IMF instructions and surviving at least for now. The Western response was notably restrained in public but far more active behind the scenes. Bloomberg carried an unusual headline, IMF patience wearing thin on Ghana. Financial Times warned that Accra's solo act risked setting a dangerous precedent for Africa. The Economist described a potential contagion of disobedience. Behind closed doors, Western think tanks like Chatham House and the Atlantic Council reportedly circulated memos urging a careful containment strategy. Ideas included delaying disbursements of existing aid, quietly pressuring credit agencies to downgrade Ghana's rating, and discouraging foreign investment by signaling uncertainty. The goal was clear: make the oxygen thinner without triggering open confrontation. Meanwhile, Ghana's domestic political theater intensified. Civil society groups demanded greater transparency, calling for a public audit of all forex interventions. University campuses hosted heated debates under banners reading "Can Ghana Survive?" Without the IMF, radio call-in shows became arenas for passionate exchanges. Some callers warning of financial collapse, others celebrating Ghana's newfound backbone. Among the diaspora, the reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Ghanaian communities in the UK, Germany, and the US saw the stronger Cedi as a reason to send more remittances. Social media was flooded with posts comparing Ghana's finance minister to historic African leaders who defied external control. But for every cheer of support, there was an undertone of caution. Even allies acknowledged the fragility of the strategy. One respected journalist in Accra summed it up: Ghana is playing a high-wire act. The view is stunning. The message is bold. But the safety net has been cut. Still, the defiance continued. On a quiet Friday morning, as markets opened, the Bank of Ghana issued a one-sentence bulletin: stabilization measures will continue in accordance with our national priorities, not external demands. That single line raced through WhatsApp groups, diaspora forums, and African news outlets. It wasn't fiery rhetoric, it was calm, deliberate, and unapologetic. And for many, it was proof that Ghana was not just talking about sovereignty, it was living it. The confrontation had now become more than a dispute between a lender and a borrower. It was a continental signal that the age of economic permission in Africa might be drawing to a close. And that, perhaps, was why the IMF and its allies were watching so nervously. In the months following Ghana's defiance, the impact reached far beyond currency charts and IMF reports. It was felt in homes, markets, classrooms, and the chambers of parliament. On the streets, the immediate effect was undeniable. Prices for imported goods stopped their relentless climb. In Cape Coast, a tomato vendor told local reporters, "For the first time in months, I don't wake up afraid of what the dollar will do to my stall." Fuel costs, heavily dependent on forex stability, held steady, allowing bus fares to remain unchanged for the first quarter in nearly a year. For working-class Ghanaians in Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale, this stability felt like a small but tangible victory. Yet the relief was uneven. In rural areas where supply chains are fragile and imports limited, many residents saw little change. Goods remained scarce and prices stayed stubbornly high. Farmers in the Upper East complained that transport costs were still eating into profits. The benefits of a stronger Cedi were real, but unevenly distributed, highlighting Ghana's long-standing regional disparities. In political circles, the battle over the interventions hardened into a national divide. Opposition MPs launched a formal inquiry into the Bank of Ghana's actions, accusing the government of bypassing oversight and risking long-term ruin for short-term applause. Former finance officials warned that burning through over $1.2 billion in reserves within 6 months was unsustainable. The ruling party framed the issue as a matter of survival sovereignty with sacrifice versus dependency with dishonor. Government spokespeople argued that the interventions had restored confidence, slowed inflation, and protected ordinary people from economic collapse. The IMF's condemnation, they insisted, was proof that Ghana was charting its own course. Civil society groups became an unexpected third force in the debate. The Ghana Civil Economics Forum released a report demanding full transparency, stating strengthening the Cedi means little if the people remain weak. They called for a public audit of all forex operations and a clear plan for rebuilding reserves. Among the youth, the mood was mixed. University graduates already frustrated by high unemployment voiced skepticism. "We're proud Ghana is standing up," one said, "but we're still waiting for something to stand on." Social media reflected this divide, pockets of fiery patriotism, alongside threads warning about the limits of defiance without structural reform. In the diaspora, however, support surged. Ghanaian communities in Europe and North America increased remittances, seeing the stronger Cedi as a window to invest back home. Prominent diaspora voices compared the government's stance to the sovereignty-first policies of President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, framing it as part of a continental awakening. Still beneath the pride, uncertainty lingered. Would salaries still be paid on time if reserves ran thin? Could fuel subsidies hold under external pressure? And perhaps most dangerously, would quiet Western retaliation, credit downgrades, delayed trade deals erode the very gains Ghana had fought for? In the end, the domestic consequences were as much about psychology as economics. For millions, this was the first time in years they'd seen their government take a bold stand against the IMF and not fold. Whether it led to long-term prosperity or short-term pain, one truth had already taken root: Ghana had shown that the rules could be challenged. From the outside, the West's reaction to Ghana's defiance seemed oddly muted. There were no fiery condemnations from the U.S. State Department, no urgent resolutions in European parliaments, no emergency IMF press briefings splashed across CNN. Instead, the response was silence, a silence that spoke volumes. Behind closed doors, that silence was strategy. Leaked memos from Western think tanks like Chatham House and the Atlantic Council revealed deep unease. The fear was not that Ghana's plan would fail, it was that it might succeed. If a mid-sized African economy could defend its currency without IMF approval and survive, it could embolden Nigeria, Kenya, or symbolically Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. The contagion they feared was not financial collapse, but the spread of economic independence. Western financial media dropped careful hints. The Financial Times warned of Ghana's solo act setting a dangerous precedent. Bloomberg called the strategy untested, but potentially inspiring. The Economist spoke of a contagion of disobedience. The subtext was clear: this wasn't just about exchange rates, it was about control. In Washington, policy advisors reportedly discussed soft containment measures, delaying aid disbursements, tightening credit conditions, and quietly signaling to investors that Ghana carried new political risk. Such tactics would not punish Ghana openly, but would slowly suffocate its momentum. Meanwhile, the story gained traction far beyond traditional newsrooms. Pan-African podcasts dissected every move of the Bank of Ghana. Diaspora influencers framed the standoff as part of a broader struggle for post-colonial sovereignty. In West African capitals, editorial boards debated whether this was the dawn of a monetary rebellion. For global institutions like the IMF, the danger lay in optics. For decades, they had cultivated the image of being partners in development. Ghana, a longtime model student, had just walked out of class mid-lesson and written its own answers. If this independent streak spread, the balance of influence in Africa could shift dramatically. In the end, the world's nervousness came down to one simple fact: instability invites intervention, but sovereignty is harder to manage. And Ghana, by refusing to ask permission, had made sovereignty visible. That was something the global financial order had not planned for and could not easily erase. Ghana's choice to defend the Cedi without waiting for IMF approval was more than a financial maneuver. It was a political statement, a shot across the bow of the global financial order. For decades, African economies have been told that stability must come through permission, that discipline means obedience, and that sovereignty is too risky to trust. Ghana tore a page from that script and replaced it with one of its own. But boldness has consequences. Every dollar spent defending the currency burns through reserves that may not be easily replaced. Quiet retaliation, credit downgrades, delayed trade deals, tightening of investment flows could erode the very gains that made this defiance possible. And while the political will to stand firm is strong today, will it hold if reserves run thin and pressure mounts? Beyond Ghana's borders, the stakes are even higher. If this works, if Ghana not only survives, but thrives, it will be proof that African nations can steer their economies without foreign supervision. That idea, more than any GDP figure, is what unsettles boardrooms in Washington, Brussels, and beyond. It could embolden Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, or Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré to challenge the old order. It could trigger what some are already calling a monetary rebellion. Yet history offers a warning. The global system rarely yields ground without a fight. Change may come not through open confrontation, but through subtle strangulation, starving a nation of credit, trade, and investment until it quietly abandons its experiment. Sovereignty is not a one-time declaration. It's a daily defense. So we are left with questions that reach far beyond Ghana. Should Africa keep playing by rules it never wrote? Or is it time to write new ones, even if the cost is high? Can a continent long defined by dependency choose independence and survive the storm that follows? If you believe Africa's strength lies in its right to decide its own economic path, share this story. If you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, subscribe now. And join the conversation in the comments. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's sovereignty-first vision has the power to change not just Africa, but the world? Because in the end, silence is no longer an option.